Today we're going to hear from Jennie Bryan-Goforth. She's going to talk to us about preserving your garden bounty. And Jennie has a master's in education and is a WSU educator focused on sustainable food systems and food access. She is the Food Safety and Preservation Coordinator and Director of the Ideas for Healthy Living program. Sounds like fun, right? For Skagit and San Juan counties. She's been an organic farmer on the same piece of rural land for over 25 years, and food preservation is an essential part of her lifestyle. She's also planned and implemented Ideas for Healthy Living, a Skagit County community education program, which is actually online with a focus on health and wellness across the life cycle. And she has more workshops coming up, so you can go to WSU site with her name plugged in, and she may talk about it a little bit today. She said that one that she's doing soon is called Grow Your Own Groceries, but she also has workshops on thriving on a plant-based diet, backyard gardening for food access, seed saving, and food preservation. Please welcome Jennifer.
So yeah, my name is Jennie Bryan-Goforth. I work with WSU Skagit Extension. I also work with San Juan County, and I work at the state level in food systems. So I have this great job where I get to work on food access, health, and nutrition. There's a lot of different kinds of things that programming has entailed over the years. And it is great because I get to sort of use my experience as an organic farmer and as someone who's grew up with food preservation and who does food preservation on a regular basis as part of my food system in my own household. And I get to sort of take that personal experience and interest and then kind of pair it with academic, training and knowledge, and then share out with the community. So it's, it works really well. I think for me, I love the work that I do, and I get to interact and work with some really incredible gardeners and farmers and things in my life. So that's been really terrific. So with the food preservation work in particular, WSU is the land grant university in our state, and so we are the sort of statewide experts on food safety and food preservation. And what's interesting is that there are relatively few people teaching this in our state currently. It's pretty unfortunate, but we're lucky in San Juan County that I don't know if it's the commissioners or who in the county in Skagit, it's a commissioners, but San Juan County has prioritized and provided some funding that allows me to do this in your county. To give a sense, there are, I think, maybe 3 of us in the whole state that are currently teaching any kind of food preservation classes. And so I get called a lot to teach in outlying areas, but those classes almost always have to have a stipend or be sort of fee-based because there isn't funding in other counties for this. So I love that San Juan County has prioritized this as an important component of food access. So what I'm going to do is today we're going to just kind of do a really brief overview of food preservation. We're going to look at some different ways to preserve food. And really the way that I like to teach this is as a strategy for food access, for reducing food waste in our household, and for making use of local food systems. I think this is something that is really particularly of interest to folks living on an island because, it's a little bit different for sure than living on the mainland. And so being able to grow, preserve, store food, I think becomes more of a priority. So we're going to look at different methods. We're just going to take a brief look at canning, pickling, fermentation, dehydration, freezing, and microclimate storage today. Normally, to give you a sense of scale, when I teach food preservation, I typically teach this as a 4-part series, and each class is about 90 minutes. So we're going to kind of jam all of that together and kind of push through that in about 45 minutes. And then we can save some time at the end for questions. So I'll just go ahead and jump right in. And please, if you're online, putting questions in the chat is great, just to make sure that they get noted so that we can answer those at the end. Okay, let's see here. So what is food preservation? So one thing that's interesting to note is that we're preserving food every time that we increase the natural lifespan of our food. So we're preserving food every day when we store it in the refrigerator or our freezer. I think we often think about that with our freezer, but with our refrigerator, I think people overlook that. And so we are all very experienced in food preservation already. And so what we'd like to do is to kind of expand on that. So this, we're familiar with refrigeration. We can also expand into canning, different types of canning. Fermentation is a way to preserve food using bacteria and yeasts. Pickling includes, foods like cucumbers in a brine of vinegar and spices. We can freeze food, we can dehydrate food, and we can also do microclimate storage. So we're going to kind of cover most of those in this class and just look at those different methods. And then kind of at the end, we'll compare a little bit, different aspects of those things. So really what the goal is with this is to help folks understand that they should really be choosing more than one to extend the harvest. There's not one that just works for everyone. I think it really depends on your own household food needs, and it also may change over time. I've noticed that, for example, I didn't freeze foods very often, 15 years ago. Mostly we were kind of off grid where I live, and so we had really minimal electricity, so freezing really wasn't an option. We have a little more availability, and so I can store more food in the freezer now. I also have found that with canning, as my household size changes, my daughters grew up and moved out of the house, I don't can as much food as I used to, and I'm starting to shift to canning more in pints than quarts. So there's things like that, right? That there's change over time. And if you can kind of cast a wide net and get a good sense of all the different options, then you have all these different tools to increase your food storage and decrease food waste. So first, we're going to kind of jump into canning. So this is probably the most important slide of all the slide decks that I have for all the 4 classes, is this particular slide. So this is related to canning, and really what we want people to take away from this is that different types of food require different preservation methods. So the canning method that's approved for a food depends on the type of food. And this is really a safety issue. Sometimes when I'm teaching food preservation, you may hear me say things like it's a safety issue or it's a quality issue. If it's a quality issue, it might mean that, if you do it this way, the food might be a little mushier, but it's not unsafe to eat. If it's a safety issue, we really, really want to make sure to stay within the safety guidelines. So this is absolutely a safety issue, and it's our probably most important one. So high acid foods can be safely canned using the water bath canning method. These are foods that naturally contain a high amount of acidity. We're going to look at this in just a minute in another slide. And then low acid foods require pressure canning. These are foods that have very little natural acidity. So there's 2 different things. We have high acid, which can be water bath canned, low acid, and those have to be pressure canned. So high acid foods, they have a pH of less than 4.6. And so they naturally have this high level of acidity. And what happens is it helps prevent the growth of some dangerous bacteria. And when we're talking about that, the dangerous bacteria, primarily the one that we're talking about is botulism. So the naturally high acidity prevents the growth of botulism in this type of food. So this is generally all fruits. Most fruits and tomatoes fit into this category. Sometimes we see a small number of foods that are kind of borderline, like tomatoes actually kind of are borderline. Some varieties are high acid, some are kind of slightly below high acid. So you'll notice that with tested and safe recipes, they always have the addition of some acid like lemon juice or something to make sure that they are the acidity is the correct level for safe water bath processing. We also have foods to which large amounts of acid are added. So this is like, cucumber pickles that you use vinegar. So you have cucumbers, you pour the vinegar over, and the cucumber is a low acid food, but the vinegar is high acid. So you compensate for the lower acidity by adding a bunch of extra acid product. And then fermented foods. So these are foods that may have started off or do start off as a low acid food, but through the fermentation process, their acidity level has been changed. So those are all different types of high acid foods. Low acid foods have a pH of more than 4.6, and the low acidity makes them an easy target for dangerous bacteria. This would be vegetables and meats primarily, right? All vegetables and meats, including poultry and seafood. These are all things that are low in acidity. We also see combination foods. So this would be something like a spaghetti, maybe most of it spaghetti sauce. So maybe most of it is tomato based, which would be considered more of a high acid food, but maybe you've got some peppers and some garlic and that kind of thing in there. So there are a few, relatively few, a number of combination foods that say have a tomato base that can be safely water bath canned if you use the tested recipe, but most combination foods are considered low acid. So this would be, a veggie soup or something like that. So the takeaway from this really is that water bath canning is only safe for high acid foods. So water bath, when you're boiling in a water bath can, and we're going to look at some pictures of what this looks like and the supplies needed and that kind of thing. But essentially, water bath canning reaches 212 degrees at sea level. And that temperature is high enough to create that safe canned product because of that naturally high acidity in those foods, right? We don't have to worry so much about things like botulism. Generally speaking, if a high acid food is not canned properly, this is not an absolute, but you tend to see signs of damage, right? You tend to see like mold or yeast or something if you have improperly canned it, whereas that's not the case with low acid foods. So pressure canning requires temps of at least 240 degrees. And when we say 240 degrees, we're talking about reaching 240 degrees in the center of the centermost jar in the canner. So this is, for one, something that we can't really measure with equipment at home, right? Like there's no way for me to measure, quart jar of chili while it's closed in a canner, and ensure that the middle of that middle jar has reached temperature. So it needs to reach at least 240 degrees, which cannot be accomplished with a water bath canner at home. You have to use special equipment for this. And this higher temperature is needed due to that naturally low acidity level of certain foods. And those foods do allow the growth of dangerous bacteria. But if we process them correctly, that the high temps, they reach a high enough temperature that those bacteria are destroyed. Now, when I teach the pressure canning class, I go into this quite a bit more. So this is like very, very little information. I'm just kind of hitting the highlights here. So we're going to kind of breeze past this slide, but pressure canning has to be used for low acid foods. I will say that before I started doing this particular job, right before I started doing food preservation, I think I've been teaching food preservation maybe like 8 years through the university. I really had no idea how many dangerous practices there were out there. It's amazing the amount of misinformation that exists online. And so at the end of this slide deck, I'm going to show you some places that you can get free recipes that are tested and safe, and it's very easy to follow safe practices, but lots of misinformation about pressure canned foods. And those are the ones that we want to be the most careful with. So that's, kind of unfortunate. Okay. So water bath canning is the one that really is the most popular, and it's also the one that people tend to start with, right? So we're going to briefly look at this process. So the required equipment for water bath canning, we have the jars with the two-piece lids. They have a ring and a lid. And the lid has to be new every time. You can't reuse the lid. They're manufactured to with that little rubberized kind of gasket for it to really to be processed one time and then stored on a shelf. So what happens if people reuse lids is that you often have seal failure. And so we want to avoid that. They're not manufactured for multiple uses. So one time only on those lids. Then we have a canner. Now this one is one of those classic canners with the lift out rack, but really any pot that is deep enough to cover the jars with an inch or two of water, and then maybe has a rack on the bottom. We want a rack on the bottom because jars can break if they're just at the bottom without a rack on when the boiling water bath is happening. So as you know, large stock pot, you really don't have to purchase any special equipment for this, but this would be kind of the classic look. And then a canning funnel is kind of a nice option. Again, not a requirement so much, these last two. And then the jar lifter, also a very nice option. But the primary ones is we need to have the jar with the two-piece lid, and then some sort of kettle with a rack. So the basic process of canning, what we do is we want high quality food in, so we get high quality food out. So it's selected and prepared according to specific directions. And these are things that have been tested in food science labs. And again, at the end of this deck, we'll talk about where you can find those safe resources. And then, so you prepare it. So if I'm making jam, for example, I'm following this jam recipe. I've cooked and prepared the jam. I'm going to then place that into a canning or mason jar with the two-piece lid. And then I'm going to, close it and heat it in a boiling water temperature that destroys those microorganisms. Now, with high acid foods, we're talking mostly about like yeasts and molds and that kind of stuff. We're not so much talking about, bacteria like botulism, like Clostridium botulinum, because the high acid prevents that from happening. But if we were canning low acid food, we would be doing the same process, just using different equipment, using a pressure canner instead of a water bath canner. So while that's happening, the heat is inactivating enzymes that can cause changes in color, flavor, texture, taste, that kind of thing. And then air is driven from the jar during the heating. So when it's boiling, the head space, the space in between the top of the product and the lid is being driven out. And then as the jar cools, the vacuum seal is formed. So one of the things to remember is that, sealing a jar is more than just, that vacuum seal. We also need to heat it to a temperature to destroy those sort of molds or yeasts, or certainly the dangerous bacteria like Clostridium botulinum. So here's some photos of kind of a basic process with making jam, for example, right? So the jam has been made, and I'm just going to say that, for people that are intimidated by something like making jam, I feel like if you can follow a box cake recipe, you can make jam. It's very, very easy. Certainly as you move more into things maybe like pressure canning, it is a little bit more challenging. Really the challenge hardly ever is about preparing the food to go into the jars. Sometimes there's a little bit, of a learning curve when you're moving to using like a pressure canner or something. But all of these things, all of the canning processes, as long as you're following the tested recipes, it's very, very easy to do. So basically, you made this jam. It's got, sugar and fruit and probably some pectin in it. And then they're measuring the headspace in the second photo. They're wiping off the tops. They're wiping off the rims with the third photo, putting the lids on and adjusting them. In the fourth, then you can see that they're going onto the rack in the boiling water bath canner. Then they're being submerged. They'll put the lid on it. They'll process it for the right amount of time. When that's done, they'll take off the lid, let it sit for 5 minutes, and then remove the jars and put it onto a padded surface and let them cool for 12 to 24 hours undisturbed. And then they're taking off the rings and they're testing and making sure that the lids have actually sealed. So it's very, very straightforward. So let's move on to another type of food that you can process in a water bath canner, and that would be pickles. So when we're talking about water bath canning, right, we said that fruits were something, tomatoes, generally, if you add a little bit of acid. And then we have foods to which large amounts of acid have been added, and we also have fermented foods. So those are all things that could be processed using the water bath canning method. So when we're talking about pickles, there are really, two different categories, and we can kind of treat them similarly. in terms of storage. So a fermented product, those have undergone a curing process during which fermentation has occurred. So lactic acid is produced, which helps preserve the product. And then we have quick pickle products. So in this one, we take, for example, cucumbers, and so that's produce. It's covered with a brine, usually of hot vinegar and seasonings. And this is one that's really easy to prepare, and it tends to have a tart flavor. Now, when you are eating homemade pickles, you're from someone, you're almost always, if you're eating, home canned pickles, it's almost always going to be quick pickles. Mostly people make those these days. We don't, people do not make fermented cucumber pickles at home as much as they used to. If you're eating sauerkraut, homemade sauerkraut, then you probably are eating a fermented product. It's interesting with some things in stores, right? There are lots of different types of fermented and pickled products available commercially. A lot of those we can also make at home, but some of them aren't really safe to make at home. They might require special equipment or storage equipment that we don't have. Again, this pickles class is usually 90 minutes. So I'm, going to kind of rush through here, but essentially, we do have a lot of different recipes through the university system, through the USDA, and through, companies like Ball for some fermented and quick pickle products. And you can store these in your refrigerator, or you can store these using a water bath canning method if you have used an approved recipe. If you just simply have made up your own recipe, like for quick pickles, say you have some cucumbers and you use some leftover brine that was from the grocery store and you pour it over, you want to store that in your fridge. You don't want to can that. If you have an old recipe and it didn't come from a safe tested source, you want to store that in your refrigerator, because we don't know if that ratio of acid to produce is high enough to prevent the growth of botulism. So we need, if we're going to can it, we need to make sure that these things have been done properly and safely, so that we can be assured of food safety. So some benefits of fermented foods. I think a lot of people are real familiar with fermented foods now, which is awesome. So basically, during fermentation, microorganisms are encouraged to grow in foods, and there are different changes that happen, right? Flavor, texture, appearance. There are some other good things. We hear about probiotics and that kind of thing with fermented foods, and again, we could spend hours just talking about the benefits of eating probiotic food. But for this class, we'll just note that there are benefits. I will say that if you heat fermented food, so if you canned sauerkraut or you canned fermented pickles, you're losing those probiotic benefits, because heat kills that live bacteria. So if you purchase sauerkraut, for example, if you're purchasing something like Booby's sauerkraut in the grocery store and it's in the refrigerated section, then you're likely getting food that, has a live bacteria, and that's the probiotic activity that we like to see. If you're purchasing sauerkraut that is shelf stable, canned in the grocery store, that is no longer, no longer has that live bacteria. Now, it does have other things. Fermented foods, we hear a lot about the probiotics, but there's also usually an increase in vitamin C, like a pretty significant increase. So there's some other things that that can happen. And so even if you're eating something that isn't live bacteria, you can still be getting kind of other benefits. Basically, the vegetables get fermented in a 2 to 3% salt solution for 2 to 6 weeks, and it then lowers the pH and creates a high acid product. And I love this quote: "Is it really safe to eat fermented foods? Properly fermented vegetables are actually safer than raw vegetables, which might have been exposed to pathogens like E. coli on the farm. The reason is the lactic acid bacteria that carry out the fermentation are the world's best killer of other bacteria." Sometimes it seems a little bit like some crazy alchemical magic to, take shredded cabbage and, as long as it has that 2 to 3% salt solution and you've kind of followed the directions and You could leave that on your counter, you know, for several weeks, and it transforms into this like incredibly delicious, highly nutritious product. But if I just left shredded cabbage on my counter, without that special 2 to 3% salt solution, without, making sure it was covered in brine and that kind of thing, it would be a disaster pretty quick, real bad. So I really want to encourage people to feel like it's safe to eat fermented foods. So preserving pickles and sauerkraut, you can water bath can them or you can refrigerate them. So water bath canning is great for low cost, long-term storage. You do have to use those tested, approved recipes because you're creating a shelf stable food. Then this is really where the food safety issue starts to become a big deal. If you're just refrigerating something, that's a shorter term storage option. It's not shelf stable, right? But whenever we're doing those shelf stable foods, that's where the food safety becomes like super, super critical. This works well for large batch preserving. So if you have a lot of, if you've got, 5 gallons of sauerkraut that you've made, most people don't have room in the refrigerator to store that, but maybe you store some in your refrigerator and then you can a bunch of it. It's definitely less expensive than refrigeration. The drawback, the main one, right, is that the heat processing destroys that live bacteria. It can also soften the products. So if you want really, really crunchy pickles, you may want to make a small batch and store them in the refrigerator. So refrigeration uses kind of more of a short to medium length storage. It's a week to a year, depending on the food recipe. I mean, there's so many different fermented foods and pickled foods, so it's a little bit challenging to just answer that, with real specifics. But it's long term, beyond a year is not really a thing. This is great for fermented foods with live bacteria. You do get crunchier pickles because they're not heat processed. It works well for recipes that are not suited to water bath canning. So that means if you want to use your grandmother's pickle recipe and you're not sure if it's safe, just make the pickle recipe and store it in the refrigerator and treat it as a short-term storage option. If you want to make up a quick pickle recipe and you can't find something comparable in the tested approved sources, this is a great way. Just put it in the refrigerator. Then it's not a shelf-stable product. It's short-term, and you would treat it like any other short-term refrigerated product that you have in your fridge. It does have limited space, and it can be more expensive due to ongoing storage costs. Okay, so we're going to move on. I think I'm doing okay on time here. Freezing, drying, and root cellars. Okay, so this, again, usually kind of a long class, but with freezing, I've just chosen a few slides out of each of the different segments. One thing to note about freezing is it doesn't sterilize food, but the extreme cold stops the growth of microorganisms and it slows down chemical changes that affect quality or cause the food to spoil. And slows down is an important one because enzyme changes are slowed but not destroyed during freezing. So if we don't inactivate certain enzymes, they can cause color and flavor changes as well as nutrient loss. This is not a safety issue, but it is a quality issue, and it's a pretty big quality issue. So we'll look at the slide about that. Do I have a slide? Okay, I'm going to go back. I'll pause here for a quick second. The main thing that we're talking about here is vegetables. So vegetables have will undergo this enzyme change when they're frozen, unless it's inactivated with blanching. And you can do steam blanching or water bath blanching. But I don't know if anyone's had this experience before, but if you don't blanch something properly, then you tend to have, you notice those changes in color, texture, taste over time. Personally, I am someone who really likes fresh food. Do not super love canned vegetables. I do not like mushy vegetables. And I have, I'm kind of a food snob. So I have real high expectations around, not overcooking food and just making sure that it's really good quality. So for years ago, I guess for some time, I did not, when I did freeze things, I did not blanch because I wanted it to be just like the freshest taste. And that was a big rookie mistake on my part. Sometimes I would take these amazing, I'd have an amazing crop of corn, right? And summer sweet corn is so delicious and it would just taste incredible. And even, I'd put it in the in Ziploc bags or something for the freezer, and it would be so delicious, and you could just eat it raw. And then, 2, 3 months later, I would pull it out of the freezer and taste it, cook it or, something, throw it in something, and it would not taste delicious. It would, all of those amazing sweet sugars kind of tasted like, honestly, like flat cardboard starches, right? Like, and what I realized later was that was that enzymatic change happening over time. So you want to inactivate those, and steam blanching or water bath blanching is not cooking. It's just a really short option. And there's guidelines for that in the materials that I'm going to suggest at the end. You don't have to do that for fruit. Or meats or things, but really it is something that is a quality issue for vegetables. Okay, so some storage methods. We talk a lot about this when I'm teaching the class. Different ways to store foods. There's all kinds of really efficient, great ways to store frozen foods and then to keep track of frozen foods. And when I'm teaching this series, keeping track of the foods and doing a food inventory and tracking not only what is available right now, but also what did you initially preserve. When did it get used up or did it not get used up in time, right? Either it expired or by the time that food was available at the next, growing season, did you still have leftovers? I track all that stuff. I'm kind of really into data. And so that has been incredibly useful to me over the years. Because it allows me to really refine my food preservation approach, and then it reduces food waste, because there's nothing worse, right, than preserving all this food that doesn't get eaten, storing, especially with the freezer, paying to store food for months, and then it just sort of goes bad because you haven't eaten it in the right amount of time. So during this class, when I teach the series, there's a lot of more information about how to track that and how to organize your freezer in a way that you can find everything. But yeah, lots of great things to do with frozen foods. And I think we're really familiar with frozen foods, but there's a lot of ways to expand your knowledge with this. Okay, moving on to drying to dehydration. So with this is probably the second oldest method of food preservation. Drying is simple, safe, easy to learn. It removes moisture from food so that bacteria, yeasts, and molds don't grow and spoil the food. The food then becomes lighter and smaller, and it's easier to store, and you can consume it dry or rehydrated. Now, I think most people really only imagine dried food as something that you're consuming as a dried food product, like raisins or, dried apple slices or something like that. And I will say that I historically dry quite a lot of food, and very little of it do I eat as like a snack product, like a dried apple slices or something. Almost always I am rehydrating the food. One thing that's kind of interesting, I think I don't have oh yeah, okay. So here's a picture of a lot of different types of things that you could dry. You'll see on the top left, there are the dried tomatoes, right? So one thing, we talked about the food becoming lighter, smaller, easier to store. I think we think about dried tomatoes, maybe, we might have sun-dried tomatoes that we might purchase in the grocery store, that kind of thing. But one thing that I do with tomatoes, right? So if I slice them and I dry them, and then I powder them using either a hand crank food mill, that's sort of like a grain grinder, but I use it for food, or I use a high powered blender like a Vitamix. If I powder it, 25 pounds, like one of those sort of standard, fruit or veggie produce boxes, 25 pounds of tomatoes fits if you dry and powder it into like a pint jar. So it's kind of an incredible way to save space. And then what you can do with that powdered tomato product is you can use that kind of in lieu of tomato paste, right? Like you can't rehydrate it and make salsa, but you can definitely add it to soups or create sauces. Maybe not like a robust marinara kind of sauce, but if you have to add a small amount of, a tomato product like paste or something to a recipe, this is a great use of that. Also just creating dips and that kind of thing. So that, and can store for a very, very long time. So there's things well beyond just, snacking, on dried fruits. You can make crackers. There's, you can do like jerky, all kinds of stuff with this. You can also see in the right side, the middle picture has kind of these kits. So this would sort of be like maybe a grab and go dried food kit for a soup that you might use maybe in an Instant Pot or a slow cooker, right? Where maybe the slow cooker, you just kind of put this right into the slow cooker in the morning, add a couple of ingredients, some water, and just let it cook throughout the day. I use a lot of dried vegetables and rehydrate them this way. This is how I avoid having to pay, top dollar for things like peppers, bell peppers in the winter. I love bell peppers. They're really expensive in the wintertime, but I like to use them, in all kinds of cooked products. So I dry some if I'm going to use them in soup, and then I freeze some if I wanted to use them in like a stir fry or something. And then I'm able to produce, really my own bell peppers, throughout the season and store them and use them all season long. So I'm buying very, very, very few. Maybe if I want to treat myself, just want a salad. Otherwise, even though it's something that I use nearly every day, I'm able to rely entirely on my own harvest and by storing them properly. Okay, so microclimate storage. So root cellars are probably not a thing really happening on the islands, but most people do not have a root cellar these days. It would be really unusual. I weirdly happen to have a root cellar, and so I've lived in this house for 25 years, or maybe actually more than that now, and we have this stone root cellar. It's very awesome. Like I'm very fortunate, I mean to say, to have this. But really, most the kind of microclimate storage that we're talking about is not really root cellar. Most people just don't have this. Microclimate storage is the oldest method of food preservation. Lots of vegetables and fruits can be stored in pits or cellars or basements or cold places without refrigeration during the cool fall and cold winter months. Now, when we're looking at microclimate storage, we often see temperature and humidity, and also a requirement for ventilation. So I think there's another slide that kind of explains those different criteria, but we want to begin by choosing easy to store food and then expanding on that. There probably is a place in your home already that you store potatoes or garlic. You probably have selected that place in your kitchen because you find that if you store potatoes in this spot, they don't, turn green or sprout as quickly as if you left them in a different spot, right? So you're already doing microclimate storage. Again, we just want to expand on this by building on our skill set. So here are some alternatives to root cellars that aside from just finding other microclimates in your house, you might have an attic space that is unheated. You might have a garage. We see a picture of the garage storage bins on the right-hand side here. But there's also, I love this deck storage box. So this is would be ideal on the north side of a house, right? Can just kind of cut a little trap door there. And then things can there's different ways to sort of store food in that space. If you're talking about storing root vegetables, which is a, really classic and easy to store item, you could then put, totes or bins and store the food in that deck storage box. The classic pit storage that we can see here, it's a hole dug into, a section of the garden. And then they have 5-gallon buckets. And if you were able to look really closely, we would see them labeled with like carrots or the they are kind of layered up with straw, and then kind of covered up. Now, sometimes people get concerned about insects or rodents. With rodents, I would just say if you're concerned about that being a problem, you can use hardware cloth, which is sort of like this metal mesh, and line things with it, right? You could line that deck storage box with hardware cloth, and then that way rodents couldn't access anything. We also have this buried container. Now, this buried container is, I would not store carrots like this, so it's a little bit misleading, but it does kind of give you an idea. We have a hole in the ground, we have one of those big trash cans, and then just a real easy, bale of straw set on the top of it. I wouldn't stack the carrots up like that. I find that when you can kind of layer carrots with something like leaf mulch or straw or sand or something, and not have them all touching each other, that they do store for a longer period of time. But this is great, right? You can have this big bumper crop of carrots, or buy that 50-pound sack that you don't have the place to store in your refrigerator, and do something like this and access it for a period of time. Okay, so what methods are right for your needs? Now, when I'm teaching this class, I have, kind of slides for each of these different segments and how I kind of break down, but I need to redo this. It's been about 7 years since I kind of figured out the price per pound. When I started teaching, I wanted to show people, not only that some were more affordable, but like exactly how much it cost. And all the information I could find at the time was really outdated. It does need kind of a refresh because costs have changed, of course. But this is basically the way that I did this. Was I looked at preserving 500 pounds of food, half of fruit and half of veg, and so how much it would cost to freeze it, right? So the fruit does not need to be blanched, but I also included with the vegetables blanching time for that, right? So the electricity, to steam or boil blanch them, and then containers to store them, that kind of thing. The freezing is the most expensive, and it has a range because of different levels of efficiency with the freezer. So the 27 cents per pound of storing food for a year was based on like a highly energy efficient, Energy Star rated kind of freezer. And the 53 cents a pound was, an older freezer that did not have the Energy Star rating. Canning is about 12 cents per pound, and that was assuming that half the food was water bath canned and half the food was pressure canned, in my 500-pound kind of algorithm. And then dehydration, only 4 cents per pound. So obviously that's the least expensive. But I think all of these have a place in people's, household food systems. And I think what would be a really great idea is to start small and build and keep information, really do well with data collection, because it's great that 25 pounds of tomatoes can be dried and powdered and fit into a pint jar. But if you don't like the taste of that product, or you really don't use that, tomato paste hardly ever, right? And it just languishes on your shelf, then it's a waste of your time, and it's a waste of the food, right? So figuring out what things your household needs, uses, some of it's about convenience, right? Like I find that that frozen food is a lot more convenient for me now than it was 20 years ago just because of my lifestyle. So I think all of these have a place, and we just need to kind of figure out, and the best way to do that is to just keep tracking data, keep tracking what you eat, what you grow, when it's consumed, how it's stored, all those kinds of things. I mean, this is really how I figured out that my family does not eat plum jam, right? Like, it doesn't matter if the plum trees, I should say, have like bumper crops. They're really going to eat maybe like a half dozen jars a year. That's it. But I could make strawberry jam. I've never run out, right? Like I don't even know how many cases I can make of that. They just eat it with a spoon. So I'm just stopped preserving more than about a half dozen jars of plum jam, because I didn't like to see those wasted, right? Anyway, so that, just using all of these different methods to preserve and increase your access is really important. Okay, so where do we find this stuff? Okay, good. We're still good on time. Okay, so the USDA has free downloadable publications, including lots of guides and recipes. If you printed it out, their guide, it would fit in like a 3-inch binder, ring binder. So it's very big, lots of information. University publications, there are lots of free downloadable publications, including guides and recipes. I think it's a little bit easier to navigate than some of the USDA stuff, because there are smaller publications or more specific, like WSU has a publication on like salsas and tomato products, for example, and it might be a little challenging to locate those through the USDA guide. Manufacturers' websites and publications. So if we're talking about pectin and making jam and that kind of thing. Pectin is a thickener to make jam. If there's a manufacturer of pectin, then they have recommendations that will work with their products. It's totally safe to use those. There are also manufacturers like Ball. Ball and Cara are the same company. If so there's like Ball, Complete Guide to Canning, that kind of thing. They've published an array of books, and they have really like a vested interest in keeping their customers safe, right? So they have testing facilities that are, that have the same criteria as USDA or university systems. So we feel that those are safe. They've been thoroughly tested. This is not true of a home food blogger. So it really is important to find the source of the recipe and make sure that it's one of these sources, right? University, USDA, manufacturer. One book, I would say that you really don't have to purchase any books. If you were going to purchase a book, I would say the So Easy to Preserve book is pretty outstanding. It's published by the University of Georgia. And it's just really actually, I think it's $25 now. Order it only through the university, not through Amazon, because for some reason it's prohibitively expensive, significantly higher through Amazon. But it's a really, really comprehensive book. Okay, so I have a couple more slides. So what I'm going to do with this is just some links to places that you could find those free resources, the different kind of publications I'm talking about. I'm going to take all of this text when I'm done with the slideshow and just put it in the chat. And then certainly it can be emailed out to participants who are there in person. And let's look here. We do have a Facebook group. If anyone is on Facebook, there's, it's a great way. It's actually called now Skagit and San Juan and Whatcom, I think, Food Preservation Group. It's I think a great way to ask questions, because although I am totally available via email to answer questions if you have things specific to a canning process or something, it's awesome when you can ask it in a forum that is public so that everyone can learn. Also, people post things during the growing season, like I'm on Lopez Island and I have the opportunity to buy this type of these tomatoes at this price in bulk. Does anyone else want to go in on this order, right? So people also share that kind of information there about sourcing. So I will put that information in the chat also. Let's here. And then this is the next class that I have coming up includes food preservation. I teach this once or twice a year. It's very popular 12-week Grow Your Groceries course. And so I believe I'm only teaching it one time this year. I sometimes do a cohort also. I think I'm going to be too busy in 2024 to do a fall cohort. So basically what happens is we spend the first 6 weeks looking at a comprehensive backyard gardening course and it's really designed for like low outside inputs, low cost, high yield, right? Like, can we grow the most food with the least amount of time and money and work? And then we have the, 2 independent classes. We have one on edible perennials. So we talk about food forests and like a little bit of permaculture kind of stuff. And then we do seed saving. And then the last 4 weeks are those 4 food preservation classes. So the reason I think this is so popular is because it covers the whole segment, right? From soil health to, microclimate storage. So lots and lots of information. So if you're interested in that, again, I can put this into the chat. It's a fee-based class, but we also have scholarships for folks, for households who have expressed a financial need. I see just one question in the chat, and that's, should chopped onions be blanched before freezing? So that's a really great question. My recollection is no. There's a couple of veggies that don't tend to require blanching. They're kind of outliers. Onions, I believe, are one. I don't blanch those. That would be, but they're in those free sources. It will show you blanching times and requirements for the different veggies. One of them also is bell peppers. Like those don't require blanching, but most of them do.
Okay, great. Do we have any questions in the room?
How long can you keep things frozen without deterioration? Like I'm talking over 12 months. Like
Yeah.
gooseberries that you haven't used.
So there are there's a publication called in one of these links, there's like freezing convenience foods and there's some different frozen food publications. Generally speaking, it's not a safety issue, right? As long as the food has stayed frozen the whole time. Sometimes, if I don't know about the islands, but where I live, we have a lot of power outages. So sometimes we have, freezer failure for a period of time. And in those situations, it may shorten the life of the food if, like, you can safely refreeze food if there's a power outage. As long as it's 40 degrees or less, or has ice crystals on the food. So if it gets a little bit defrosted and then refreezes, it can affect the quality, but it's not a safety issue. I would say it can last a really long time, like well over a year. It's just going to be about quality. So and freezer burn, right, is about it's what's happening when we have those really delicious freeze-dried foods, right? Like freeze-dried strawberries or something. That's what's happening with like chicken when it's been freezer burnt, right? It's dehydrating in a frozen environment. So the better you can wrap and package, the less likely that you're going to come across that. But that doesn't actually make it unsafe. It actually just makes it possibly lower quality. And in those situations, I would really recommend, maybe you don't take a piece of meat out that is freezer burned and use it as a, like, I don't know, roast or something, but maybe you mixed it into a soup or that kind of thing. And so that it reduces that safety, or the quality change. But I'd be hard pressed to say like a recommendation based on safety, because as long as it's frozen, I think people have personal, like, if it was like you found some carrots that were, in there for 18 months or 2 years, I think that should be fine, as long as they were, continue to be frozen the whole time. Does that answer your question? Does that work?
Yeah. I'm talking things like a year and a half, gooseberries, chestnuts in the seal and the other kind of situation where, so they're.
Yeah, I think those are totally fine. Again, you might see a difference with the quality, but as far as safety goes, it shouldn't be an issue.
How would you preserve eggplants? And I'm saying this because at the end of the season, we harvested like several 5-gallon buckets of Japanese eggplants that had never gotten that big. And I put them in the freezer and then they were terrible. So what would you do with them to keep them?
Yeah. Well, there is a process for blanching eggplant and freezing it. I have tried that and did not have great luck. And when you blanch it, and freeze it, you're supposed to like really make sure that the water content after you blanch it is low, so you have to really pat them dry and let them dry before you package them into the freezer. Definitely that's going to be better than just slicing it and putting it in the freezer. But I didn't like how that tastes, the taste of that. So There are a couple of recipes that you can do pickled products that have eggplant in them. But in terms of freezing, what I generally do is I roast the eggplant and I just have roasted eggplant slices plain that then I can add to like a marinara or that kind of thing. Or I sometimes make a recipe, like there's a East Indian dish, vegan barta, that's like tomatoes and eggplant, and I just make those and freeze them. As far as freezing eggplant that you're going to be able to slice and bread and fry in the middle of the winter, I haven't found a great method for that. I think we don't see a lot of frozen eggplant in the freezer and section of our grocery store, and I think the quality is kind of challenging. I've also breaded them and frozen them. That was a little bit better, but they're still soggy.
I make a baba ganoush.
So you could freeze that. I mean, that's the beauty of freezing things, right? Like, you don't have that kind of restriction with safety that you do with canning, right? Like I couldn't say like, oh, well, just, I can't can roasted eggplant, but I can freeze it.
You mentioned powdering the dehydrated tomatoes. I didn't quite catch what you powder it with.
I used to use this food mill that was actually a grain mill made by a company called Victorio, and it was designed really for grain, but it was small and it had had steel burrs, so you could use something like a coffee grinder, something with steel burrs, not something with stone. But honestly, a Vitamix works great. I used to also try to use a food processor. I would not recommend that because it actually really beats up a food processor. If you use it with a blade and you're trying to powder vegetables or fruits with it, the food sometimes gets stuck with the blade and then makes kind of weirdly divots in your plastic. Like it's not a good option, but the high powered blender like a Vitamix or Bullet or something also work great.
But what is the powder made of?
Tomatoes, like dried tomato, like the one that I was talking about was dried tomatoes and then powdered.
I see.
But I do that also with like mushrooms. We on an average year we try to harvest about 75 pounds of chanterelle mushrooms, and all of those get sliced and dried and powdered. And then I use that like as a base in soups and sauces and all kinds of stuff. You can make like fancy salts with powdered, vegetables and that kind of thing. So yeah, I dry and powder several different things every year.
Hey, we have another question. I was wondering, is bulk health suitable for water bath canning? And what might be the shelf life of it is?
We say the name, the product again. I couldn't hear it.
Bulk health seaweed.
Oh, I don't know of I don't know of any recipes. I've never seen a recipe for seaweed. My guess is no, and I would also guess that it would probably have to be something, if there was a recipe, it'd be pressure canned, but I think there are no recipes that exist. It doesn't mean that there couldn't potentially be a safe way to preserve that at home, but what it means is that there is, if I'm correct, and there isn't a recommended recipe, it just hasn't been tested. And there are some things that aren't safe for home products at all. And there's some things that we just don't have the research for, because as you might imagine, there's not a lot of funding available at the federal level or in the university system for testing new recipes. One example of something that we can buy in the grocery store that isn't safe at home is like pumpkin pie filling. If you look at canning recommendations from before 1994, you'll see all these recipes for pureed pumpkin pie or pumpkin filling, right? Just like we buy in the grocery store. But what they found is it was some botulism risk with that. And upon further testing, they changed the recommendation. So everything after 1994 says to pressure can chunks of pumpkin in water. And the reason for that is because, as we probably all know, with winter squash, there are some types of winter squash that are really dense and dry and some that are really watery. And so it was really about like viscosity and density. The recommendations for pureed products just could not ensure with the equipment that we have at home that we could reach 240 degrees in the center of the centermost jar, because is it like a more watery product or is it a dense product? So sometimes those recommendations, and also we just don't have the equipment that's required at home. So, but yeah, I would say no. I would say freezing would be the way to do the seaweed. That would be the only
Acidic.
option I'm aware of.
It probably isn't acidic, is what I'm thinking, so. Let's see.
You can look but unfortunately, because when they're doing the testing, it's not just about acidity level, right? Like that's the one that's really obvious. But the recommendations are also about things like density and viscosity and, all kinds of other qualities. And so, unfortunately, isn't safe for us to use like pH paper or something, to determine whether or not something is safe to preserve, using different methods. I'm gonna just out of curiosity look up the pH level for seaweed right now.
It's highly hydrated.
Oh yeah, 8 and 9. Oh, between 7 and 9. Yeah. Is that right? That is what it says. So yeah, really, yeah. I mean, that must be the reason that it's a safe process for it, because it's high acid food has less than 4.6, and so this would be considered extremely low acid. Seaweed would.
How long can you freeze flour, both white flours and whole grain flours, in terms of both taste and nutrition?
That is a good question. I would look that up. Let me see if I can just find one for you. And when I'm doing, sometimes I'm doing a search like within the university system, but sometimes if I'm just like doing a Google search, my suggestion would be to use your keywords and add things like extension, university, USDA, and then you're more likely to find those recipes more quickly. Let's look here. Yeah, this one says, and there's a site called Ask Extension, and this is extension folks like me all over the country who answer questions for these things. So this one says, freeze flour for long-term storage. The recommendation 12 months. Whole wheat flour can be kept refrigerated or frozen for 6 to 8 months, or specialty flour is also the same, but otherwise 6 to 12.
Thank you.
Has there been any research in pressure canning with an Instapot?
There hasn't, but there is a type of electric pressure canner that is on the market. The Instant Pot won't probably ever be approved for pressure canning because there is no way to measure the temperature. It just gets up to a certain, so it's not, just by its very nature, isn't designed to measure temperature, I guess, internal temperature. There is a product made by Presto that is an electric pressure canner, and that we don't, like the USDA, for example, doesn't test or approve equipment. Presto says that it meets or exceeds all of the requirements. Personally, I have one and I love it. It works quite a bit like an Instant Pot. But again, it can measure the temperature and that kind of thing so that it's safe for canning. The University of Oregon has been testing this piece of equipment for the last few years, and we've all been waiting in the university system for the report to come out to say whether or not it met the testing requirements. They're kind of expensive. You can cook with them, and you can also use them as a water bath canner. But they are, I want to say maybe like $300 or something. But they're, yeah, very easy and convenient. It's made by Presto.
I am a canner and a little bit of a rebel canner, so I'm trying to sort my USDA from my old wives' tales. When you're doing really large batch canning and you're gonna start it one day and finish it another day because it takes so long and you keep it in the refrigerator, what is the USDA's position on hot start, hot food, cold start, cold food?
So it depends. Like I definitely have done probably some similar things that you're talking about where maybe I just can't I get through 2 out of 4 batches through the pressure canner before the end of the day happens, right? So the deal is the recommendation is, for example, for the food to be hot when it goes into the jar, which it often is. If it says that the hot pack is required, then you have to do the hot pack. So that just means you have to to bring it up to the temperature. And that the reason for that is because if say I was like pressure canning green beans, for example, actually green beans are a bad example because I think you can have those raw pack or hot pack. But at any rate, if there was something that required, say, 45 minutes in the pressure canner at 10 pounds pressure, you would need the food to be at that 240 degrees. And the way that we measure that, right, is the timed, and the pounds pressure and all that. That is all dependent on the food, the recipe, so the food being up to a certain temperature when that process starts. So if it was supposed to be hot and it was ice cold coming out of the fridge, basically when it got into the jar, then you could see a decreased level of like effectiveness with the pressure canner. So for example, don't vent the canner properly. There was a study that showed it was a 30% reduction in like a 20-minute period if you just didn't vent the pressure canner properly. Which means that you would have a botulism risk even if you were processing for the right amount of time. If it was like 40 minutes at 10 pounds pressure, if you did that, but you just didn't vent it properly, then you still have the botulism risk. So the temperature thing is a pretty big deal.
And can you also talk about dry canning, pressure canned foods like potatoes, for example? I know is a really common one to dry can. Is that USDA approved, or are they all supposed to be
It is
covered?
not. Yeah, I mean, there are a couple of things where like chicken, I think is one, where there's some that you don't add liquid, but almost, I can't think of any vegetables that are like that. There's a lot of information online for things that we just that are not safe to can to ensure that we don't have a botulism risk. So like canning butter is something that sometimes is popular. We can't actually can dairy products like at home. Certainly there's cream of chicken soup available in the grocery store, but the pressure canner just doesn't get to temperature in the right temperature that is required to can those things. Same with like starches. We can't can anything with noodles. Again, chicken noodle soup is available in the grocery store, but we can't ensure safety at home with that. And it's one thing that's kind of interesting to note about because there's lots of canning practices all over the world. is that if you look at CDC information around botulism, we actually have like a significant portion of the botulism cases in the United States are on the west coast of this continent, and a couple a state or two inland. And one of the reasons for that is because we have more natural botulism in our soil in this region of the world than other places. And so some things that might be safe in a different place in the world, they might can carrots, in a water bath canner or something, and no one in the family got sick. Part of it might just be, well, people were lucky, but also part of it might be the risk is just lower, because if we pull a carrot out of the ground, in New Hampshire, we have just not that likely that it's going to have botulism spores on it. But on the West Coast, we have a lot more natural botulism in our soil. And so we're dealing with a different level of baseline. If that makes sense.
Thank you. Do you have any other questions on the Zoom or in the room? Okay, well, Jennie, thank you so much. That was just very informative. Takeaway for me is I've been actually experimenting with drying bow tie pasta in my dehydrator. And it's coming out really well. I'm still not quite sure when I'm sure that it's dry. So I'm experimenting with times, but it has been really fun to do that.
Neat.
Yeah. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And so again, people should feel free to reach out to me with any questions. I'm happy to answer. If sometimes there are questions that are just really complicated, and we can arrange a time for a phone call if that's, necessary. I'm totally available.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Okay, great.
We're doing things a little bit different today. We're actually going to have our poem now. Nancy Reese, who is one of our amazing newsletter writers, has offered to share a poem with us. And after the poem, we'll conclude our Zoom meeting and wish everybody good holidays.
Okay, I did not write this. I found it online, and it's actually, the author is unknown, and then the person that I read it that had it online kind of played with it, and I played with it a little bit more, so I don't know, it'll be fun. All right. Was the night before Christmas, and all through the yard the branches were bare and the ground frozen hard. The roses were dormant and mulched all around to protect them from damage when frost heaves the ground. The perennials were nestled all snug in their beds, while visions of fertilizer danced in their heads. Newly planted shrubs had been soaked by a hose to settle their roots for a long winter's doze. And out on the lawn in the new fallen snow, protected the roots of the grasses below. When, what to my wondering eyes should appear, but a Prius full of gifts of gardening gear. Saint Nick was the driver, a jolly old elf, and he winked as he said, "I'm a gardener myself. I've brought you new seeds and light systems too. Give them a try and see how they do. To eliminate weeding, I brought bags of mulch to attract the pollinators to our flowers for best results. For seed planting days, I've a trowel and a dibble and a roll of wire mesh if the rabbits should nibble. I have the latest books, plus some gadgets you'll love, plant stakes and frames and waterproof gloves. Here are sharp shears and a new compost pit, and for pH detecting, a soil test kit. With these colorful flagstones lay a new garden path for a view from your window, a bird feeder and bath. And last but not least, some well-rotted manure. A green garden year-round, these gifts will ensure. Then jolly old Saint Nick, having emptied his load, started his Prius and took on the road. I heard him exclaim through the motor's soft hum, "Merry Christmas to all, and to all a green thumb."